Good evening, friends. You are most welcome to Think channel. Today we are going to discuss social anthropology by Maan IGNOU, and our code is mane004. Topic is gender and society. Let us begin the topic. First, we will discuss approaches to the study of gender. Unit 1, we will discuss conceptual perspective on gender. Unit 2, we will discuss patriarchy and male dominance. Unit 3, we will discuss discrimination and subordination. Let us begin the introduction part. Gender has been a much discussed and debated concept from the 70s onwards, although the roots of the discourse were laid much earlier. The contribution of anthropologists towards gender as a theoretical construct was based largely on the huge amount of cross cultural material that is the sustaining database of the discipline. From the material from various cultures and societies, anthropologists were able to take on a critical stand towards existing myths of gender construction and patriarchy, such as the nature culture debate, the concept of biological determinism, and the public private dichotomy, to name a few. The interface of gender as an analytical tool with previously existing social and cultural parameters such as class, ethnicity, caste, sexuality, kinship, and marriage, to name some, gave rise to a staggering amount of literature and research work. Some of these extended way beyond the limitations of gender to affect theory at the macro level, especially those that challenged the objective character of science and what was deemed a masculine methodology of assumed objectivity. The introduction of gendered subjectivity into theory building challenged the very foundations of scientific methodology and the assumptions of truth status for many so called scientific facts, including Freudian psychoanalysis and many biological and anthropological assumptions. Gender was seen as one of the prime yet cultural constructs that had a powerful effect on the organization of social relationships, particularly manifested in the almost all pervasive existence of patriarchy. The assumption of a universal patriarchy gave rise to feminism as a theory and a movement, but anthropology has constantly engaged in a troubled relationship with feminist theories, often making seminal contributions of its own based again on cross cultural perspective. Anthropologists have shown that concepts formulated in a Western context often have different meanings and implication in different cultures, like patriarchy may operate at a completely different dimension than as understood in the West, or the meaning of terms like public and private may differ as economies and societies are organized along completely different premises. In the three units here you will learn about the theoretical premises of the construction of gender reflected in how masculine and feminine are understood differently cross-culturally, and how such construction may vary across both time and space. Gender constructions are informed through cosmological and other political and economic structures of society and constantly change as these social conditions change. Gender is thus both dynamic and transformative in nature. You may also learn that not all societies confine gender to the dichotomy, and there may be more than two genders, as in India. Patriarchy may manifest itself in various ways, and kinship norms and values are both organized around and inform gender constructs. We find gender norms and stereotypes reflected almost every aspect of our daily lives, and it is hoped that after reading these lessons, the student will be able to understand that many day to day myths and taken for granted aspects are nothing but constructs that are culturally constructed and socially transmitted. Unit 1, we will discuss conceptual perspectives on gender. First, introduction part, then definition of gender, then concept of gender, difference between gender and sex, gender ideology, gender stratification, gender identity, gender stereotypes, femininity and masculinity meanings, origin of terms femininity and masculinity, dichotomy of femininity and masculinity, relation, significance, and contribution of femininity and masculinity on religion, sexuality, and culture in India. And at the last, we will discuss summary. Learning objectives are after this reading unit, you will be able to learn, understand the concept of gender and its varied ramification from an anthropological perspective, comprehend the theoretical discourse on gender and understand about relationship within and cross gender, and augment your perception on femininity and masculinity and its critical relation with culture, sexuality, and religion. Augment your perception on femininity and masculinity and its critical relation with culture, sexuality, and religion. Introduction part. The unit begins by exploring the definitions of gender and investigates the interface between the concept of gender and sex. It highlights the matrix of relationship of gender with other related spheres like sex, identity, ideology, stratification, stereotype, and the like. It also investigates the issue revolving around femininity and masculinity, the impact of the discourse of femininity and masculinity on religion, sexuality, and culture are also discussed. Definition of gender. According to Anne Oakley, 1972, gender is a matter of culture. It refers to the societal classification into masculine and feminine. In other words, gender refers to a specific cultural meaning system that attaches to being a male or a female. Gender is a sexualized identity of individuals in relation to the customs, traditions, way of life, and the like. It is the social and cultural construction of roles, tasks, attitudes, values, and qualities of males and females. The formation of gender differs from one culture to the another, as it is a culture specific aspect. The community or society as a whole contributes to the definition of gender. Often, our society influences us about the ways in which we expect males and females to behave and live in a certain way. Next heading is concept of gender. Gender is multifaceted reality that is culturally constructed and socially determined by the society. In other words, gender portrays culturally and socially constructed roles, responsibilities, privileges, relations, and expectations of women and men. Because these are socially constructed, they can change over time and differ from one place to another. Gender refers to behavioral differences between males and females that are culturally based and socially learned. Applebaum and Clambliss, 1997. Sometimes gender is referred mistakenly only to women, although it deals with the distinctive social construction of both men and women. The basic difference between men and women is the principle of biological reproduction, in which this biological differences overshadows the other qualitative variations and achievements. Juliet C. W. Mitchell opened that The concept of gender was introduced in the early 1970s to distinguish the acquisition of social attributes from biological ones for which sex was reserved. In her view, gender is now an inclusive term that ultimately has come to include even biology. Michael believed that gender did not have a history or a psychology in which gender has come to replace women, as in gender studies versus women's studies. At exactly that point, where the intimate association between women and procreation is tending to wither away, she argued that to think of women is to think of women and children. To think of gender is to think of men and women, but it is also to think of women and women or men and men. This is the point. Margaret Mead's 1935 study of the three societies in the New Guinea Islands, though constatable, contestable, though contestable on several grounds, contributed significantly to the shaping of the concept of gender in the later half of 20th century. The functionalist notion of sex role was also a crude precursor of the concept of gender. It suggested that men and women are socialized into sex specific roles, namely instrumental and expressive. These roles were regarded as the basis of a complementary relation between men and women, which, along with the sexual division of labor, contributed to the stable social order. Scholars have questioned the focus of this conceptualization upon individual men and women who are socialized into sex specific roles. They suggest that gender is something more than roles performed by men and women, just as economies are something more than jobs performed by individuals. Lorber, 1984. Critics have also pointed out the socialization is always a precarious achievement and that agency, interpretation, and negotiation are a part and parcel of how gender identities are actually constituted. Our another heading is differences between gender and sex. Let us begin this. Gender gives attention to the socially constructed characteristics of men and women. Gender is a social construct, whereas sex is a biological makeup of male and female. Sex is what we are born with and does not change over time nor differs from place to place. According to Kendall, 1998, sex is a biological difference between men and women. It is the first label we receive in life. In some cultures, gender deals with women's supposed vulnerability, their identity as the second sex or fairer sex, and their need to be protected. The main gender difference is basically in the biological functions of reproduction. Barbara F. McManus, 1997, also argued that feminist scholars have been differentiating sex from gender and view the latter as a socially or culturally constructed category. She asserts the gender is learned and performed. It involves the myriad and often normative meanings given to sexual differences by various cultures. She opines that feminists may differ in the importance they assign to sex, which is a biological based category, but the idea that gender norms can be changed is central to feminist theory. Although sex and gender systems differ cross culturally, most known societies have used and still use sex and gender as a key structural principle organizing their actual and conceptual worlds, usually to the disadvantage of women. Although sex and gender systems differ cross-culturally, most known societies have used and still use sex and gender as a key structural principle, organizing their actual and conceptual words, usually to the disadvantage of women. McManus has the same opinion, with feminist scholars who argued that gender is a crucial category of analysis and that modes of knowledge which do not take gender into account are partial and incomplete. The distinction between sex and gender, which come which came to dominate the theorization in the sociology of gender in the 1970s. The distinction between sex and gender, which came to dominate theorization in the sociology of gender in the 1970s, is premised upon the idea of universality of sex and variability of gender, and Oakley's Sex, Gender and Society 1972 made the sex gender distinction very popular in sociology. For Oakley, sex is a word that refers to the biological differences between male and female, the visible differences in genitalia, the related difference in procreation function. The term sex and gender can be traced to Robert Stoller, an American psychiatrist who used the term to deal with cases of individuals whose biological sex did not match their gender. The prominent theorist of feminist anthropology, Henrietta Murray, 1988, argued that there was nothing self-evident or determinate about gender, and that anthropology, with its capacity to understand how differently cultures around the world conceive of gender and sex, it could not treat the idea of womanhood as straightforward and unproblematic. On the other hand, Simon de Beauvoir 2010 states that males and females are two types of individuals who are differentiated within one species for the purpose of reproduction. They can be defined only correlatively. At the same time, Aryabandhu 2009 states that gender refers to the biological or sexual differences between men and women which make substantial distinction in how they behave, relate, and respond to needs of the family, kinship, caste, community, society, and the state. These factors are indications of gender differences and gender roles, which were facilitated by the process of socialization, customs, norms, historical traditions, and the government machinery. Undoubtedly, the epistemology of sex needs to be briefly examined through Michael Foucault's philosophy. Foucault 1976 argued that the role of sex and sexual activity in the discourse of Western society during 17th century made a fundamental and radical change. His investigation of discourses on sex arrives at a consequence to the commonly held conviction that there was a gigantic repression of sex. Foucault raises questions on whether or not sexual repression is truly an established historical fact, whether prohibition, censorship, and denial are truly the forms through which power is exercised in a general way, if not in every society, and whether there really was a historical rupture between the age and of repression and the critical analysis of repression. He pointed out that through the evolution of Christianity and its doctrine, especially of making confession regarding sexual sins, society was compelled to start on an elaborate and exhaustible discourse on sex, Simon de Beauvoir opined that one is not born but rather becomes a woman. Beauvoir clarifies that gender differences in society make men superior through their role as breadwinners. Their theoretical framework of gender needs to be drawn further from Margaret Mead and Simon de Beauvoir. Mead 1928 revealed how the behavior of men and women differed from one culture to another and thereby challenged the notion that all gender differences were innate. On the other hand, Beauvoir argued that the division of the sexes is a biological fact, not an event in human history. Male and female stand opposed within a primordial mid-scene, and women is not broken it. The couple men and women is a basic unity with its two halves riveted together, and the cleavage of society along the line of sex is impossible. The critical trait of women is that she is the other, in the totality of which the two components are essential to one another. Beauvoir argued that women is heavily handicapped, though her situation is beginning to change gradually. Even till today, although women's legal rights such as Dowry Prohibition Act 1961, Domestic Violence Act 2005, Hindu women's right to inherit property, and the like are legally recognized, a long-standing custom prevents their full expression in the mores. Despite the constitutional guarantees, Indian women do not enjoy absolute legal and equal rights with men. Our people uphold the gender biases and culture of patriarchy that are deeply entrenched in the society. In Beauvoir's view, both men and women can also be said to make up two castes from economic perspective, other things being equal. The former hold the better jobs, get higher wages, and have more opportunity for success than their new competitors. She asserted that in industry and politics, men have a great many more positions and they monopolize the most important post. Today, women are beginning to take part in the affairs of the world, but it is still a world that belongs to men. To decline to be the other, to refuse to be a party to deal, this would be for women to renounce all the advantages conferred upon them by their alliance with the superior caste. Leela Dubey 2001 deals with the intricacy of gender in her empirical study of the Gond tribal society in southern Chhattisgarh during the 1950s. She pointed out that an encounter between an anthropologist as a woman vis-a-vis society appears to be a relationship that is determined by gender, with the understanding that flows from sensitivity of understanding by the actors involved. Dubey, being a woman anthropologist with a rich experience and having the same biological and cultural imperatives of marriage, family, and childbirth that every woman encounters in her life, was able to create a conducive rapport in which she interacted meaningfully with the Gond tribal women and understood about their struggles. With regard to gender roles, Massionis 2002 cited Talcott Parsons, an American sociologist who claimed that complementary gender roles between men and women promote the social integration of families and society as a whole. In other words, Parsons opened that gender forms a complementary set of rules that bond women and men into family units for carrying out various important tasks. Women take primary duty for managing the family and raising children, whereas men join the family to the outside world through their participation in the labor force. Parsons argued that distinctive socialization teaches both men and women about their suitable gender identity and skills. Boys were taught to involved in the labor forces and also to be rational, self assured, and competitive. On the other hand, girls were taught to be absorbed in the process of child rearing, domestic chores, and being sensitive. The processes of socialization facilitate children to learn and internalize the norms and values of the family, community, and society and learn to perform their respective roles. Both boys and girls were nurtured to become men and women through socialization in child rearing, family beliefs, education, various jobs or services, and cultural practices. Gender role deals with different responsibilities and expectations that society defines and allocates to men and women. These are not necessarily determined by biological makeup and therefore can change with time and in different situations. Gender involves the matrix of relationship between men and women, which can be changed from a patriarchal to an egalitarian one. Therefore, gender is a collective and societal formation which is often stereotyped and can be altered, while sex is perceived as unchangeable as it is a natural institution in the past. However, with medical advancement, innovation, and scientific technological revolution, sex can be altered in our contemporary society. The subject of sex change or sex transplant or transgender has become a critical and sensational public discourse in India today. Transgender is an individual who is often assigned a sex at birth but who considered that he or she belonged to the opposite sex and his or her natural given sexual characteristics is an imperfect discrimination of himself or herself. Here we would provide a brief description about gender ideology and how it influences the process of gender stratification and gender identity. It will also examine the way in which gender stereotypes take place in the society. After this, we will discuss gender ideology. Thank you very much.